Alrighty, welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, August 7th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the Pac-12, Oregon State and Washington State up there in the Pacific Northwest, talk about some of the different steps that they're taking to go forward here. It sounds like the Big 12 is a real option for them going forward, and we'll break down all of the different details there. Then we'll get into Week 1. We'll talk about who needs a Week 1 win the most. We could talk about Georgia, Notre Dame, Penn State, so many different teams that definitely need that Week 1 win, but there's one team in particular that I think needs it more than anyone, and I'll get into that in the second segment. Then we'll react to the coaches poll. It came out a couple of days ago, definitely some very interesting things in there, and I want to break down who I think is too high, who I think is too low, and then pretty much everyone else is right where they should be relatively. Then we'll get into who needs to make the most out of fall camp. We've kind of been doing this over the last couple of days. We'll continue on today with 6 more teams for you guys. Then we'll get into conference questions, and we'll go to the Big Ten today. We did the SEC yesterday, so we'll get into the Big Ten today with a ton of different questions going into this 2024 season. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcsportsnetwork.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and that's always good for the both of us. So if you'd like to use that, ask any question you'd like. That, again, is gsmcpodcast.net. But let's go ahead and jump into segment 1 here, and let's talk about Oregon State and Washington State. They've kind of been sitting out there in the Pacific Northwest alone for quite some time, really since the Pac-12 season ended, but at the end of the day, it became official on August 1st. So they are officially alone, they are officially out there on their own, and the money starts rolling in from some of the people that left them behind. There are a ton of different questions about what the future is going to look like for the Pac-12 and where they could kind of set up shop for the future. The Mountain West was a real option, but it sounds like they're not too keen on joining with these two entities at this point. It sounds like one conference is, though, and that is the Big 12. I want to talk about them real quick because Washington State and Oregon State really just need a lifeline. There's no two ways about that. Frankly, I think they almost have waited too long at this point, but especially over the next little bit, they're going to have to get something in writing. They're going to have to get into some conference going forward and be at least comfortable, be in a place where you know what your future looks like to 2030, because there's a lot of teams that can't say the same thing. So Washington State and Oregon State are kind of in an interesting spot, and Teresa Gould, the Pac-12 commissioner, is in a really interesting spot because you have a lot of options at your disposal, right? You can jump on a number of different ships, and you can, join a group of 5 conference. You can try to get into the ACC. You can wait for everything to start crumbling and try to get an invite to the Big Ten, possibly. The Big 12 is obviously an option here. So there's a ton of different options at their disposal, but there's a difference between having all the options at your disposal hypothetically and realistically. Hypothetically, they have all of those options in the future. Hypothetically, all of that stuff could fall into place, but a lot of stuff needs to go right for that stuff to fall into place. And I think that's the biggest thing that I've kind of unpacked here is when you look at these two programs, the Big 12 would be a great landing spot. There's no two ways about that. I think they would likely be in the Big 12 if there wasn't such a number of teams that you could choose from the Big 12's perspective a year ago, and they probably just didn't have the money to bring in 6 teams. 4 was probably the right number, but this would be a great place for them to end up. You have some of those Pac-12 teams that you've been playing for a number of years already in that conference. You have, a really not as remotely as aggressive of a travel schedule as some of the other people do, unless you have to go down to UCF, then we have a totally different conversation. And frankly, it sounds like that is part of the group that is not too much in favor of this. It sounds like they took a straw poll at some point throughout the last week, 2 weeks, and 5 teams, West Virginia, Cincinnati, Oklahoma State, Kansas, and UCF, were not in favor of this happening. And I think when you're talking about West Virginia, Cincinnati, and UCF, I think the travel has to play a huge role in that, right? You never want to be the team traveling 3,000 miles, 2,000 miles to go play a football game on a Saturday. So that's obviously going to be a factor in Oklahoma State and Kansas, I'm not exactly sure what's going on there, but overall, there is going to be some pushback on this. But it sounds like more and more that ESPN is in favor of this. And frankly, if that's the case, this thing is over. It's almost definitely going to happen. If ESPN is pushing for the Big 12 to do this, then they're going to do it. I can promise you that, because that's where a lot of the money comes from. So there's no doubt in my mind that if ESPN is really behind this, then it's almost definitely going to happen. Now, there's questions of how much they are really behind it and how much the Big 12 is really into this, because a lot of this stuff is just conjecture. It's a lot of rumors going around, a lot of different things kind of bouncing around, and we really don't know what is real, because we haven't heard anything from Brett Yormark, or we haven't heard anything from Teresa Gould on this matter. So obviously a lot of this stuff happens behind closed doors when we don't know what's happening, but it's still one of those things that we can look at as an option. Nothing is set in stone by any means as of right now. So there are a number of different things out there. There are so many different options out there, whether it's them joining the conference immediately and possibly not taking the media deal for the time being, whether it's, joining as a football program and maybe Oregon State as a baseball program, but not joining as any other part of their athletic department, and then they go out and get UConn and Gonzaga to join the Big 12 as basketball teams. So there's a number of different options on the table for what could happen as the Oregon State and Washington State, as they kind of move into this next chapter of what's going on. But I do think the big thing here is when they join the, let's say, hypothetically, when they join the Big 12, let's just use that as the moniker right now. When they join the Big 12, the money from the Pac-12, the other teams in the Pac-12 stops. So I believe it's somewhere over $200 million that is set to come in throughout the next, number of years from the 10 teams that left them behind. That stops because they are no longer the Pac-12. That is a huge reason why they've been trying to keep the Pac-12 moniker as they've gotten into discussions with the Mountain West, because that's the way they keep the money rolling in. And that is a huge, huge thing for these two programs. So you're in kind of an interesting spot. You ask the question of, do you want stability? Do you want to know where you are, know what conference you're going into, and know that that conference is going to be there in 5 years? Or do you want that big time money coming in every single year, be able to kind of field offers and see what happens? I'm firmly on the side of they need stability right this second. I think Oregon State and Washington State and the Pac-12 in general have waited just a little bit too long. I think they need a place like the Big 12 to set up shop, because at this moment in time, they have only lost the amount of power that they had. It felt like when when all the teams left the Pac-12, it really felt like they were in a position to make a lot of a really bad situation, because they had all this money coming in, because they had so many different things bouncing around, that they had an ability to kind of sit back and let things develop and see if they can find somewhere to end up. Now you're at a position where there's a reality where you don't end up anywhere, especially when the ACC comes around and possibly crumbles in a couple of years here, and the Big 12 has Clemson and Florida State and UNC and a number of other teams to choose from before they would even get to Oregon State and Washington State. Frankly, I think you could get all the way down to Georgia Tech and Pittsburgh before you would really have to have a conversation between, is it better to go get Pittsburgh or is it better to go get Oregon State? Everyone above them is absolutely a better asset than Oregon State or Washington State for the Big 12. Now, one thing I will say is that guy right there, Brett Yormark, is one of the most creative commissioners in current day, because he is someone that is attacking realignment in pretty much every facet you could possibly think of. He is doing it, if they have to add certain sports, they're going to do that. If they have to add, elite, programs overall and elite universities, they're more than welcome to do that. So he's bouncing around a number of ideas. So it's a possibility that Oregon State and Washington State go in as a football program, but not with basketball, baseball, or any of the other sports. There's a reality where they go in as football and baseball, but nothing else. There's a reality where they go all the way in, but don't take a ton of the media deals over the next 5 or 10 years. So there's a number of different things on the table, but I can tell you confidently that if Brett Yormark sees the more money to be made, he's going to take that opportunity, because he's a fantastic businessman, and he's someone that has approached this realignment stuff with a lot of foresight and a lot of aggression. So I don't necessarily think it's going to stop right now. I think when you look at Oregon State and Washington State, they're kind of in a position where you're a little bit backed into a corner. You're not necessarily in a spot where you can demand much, or you can really wait too much longer, because we know what's happening over in the ACC. We know that there's a reality where in the next couple of years, that is no longer a big-time conference, and that's something that not only the ACC has to worry about, but Washington State and Oregon State have to worry about. We just talked about, at least 2/3 of that conference are more valuable products than these two schools. Now, I do think these two schools could add a lot to the Big 12, but you have to figure out when you're going to do it. And frankly, I think if the Big 12 is offering right now, if that is totally true, and frankly, there are a lot of conflicting reports. Some say the Big 12 has no interest. Some say there is an offer coming on the table in the next week. So there's a number of different things going around. We'll obviously know more as it kind of unfolds, but what I will say is they can't wait. If there is an offer on the table, if ESPN is in on this, if everyone is pushing in the same direction, particularly ESPN, but let's just say there is enough people in that conference, presidents, ADs, all of those people that are pushing in the same direction to add these two right this second, they have to jump at that opportunity because there's a chance that it's not there in a year or it's not there in 2 years. And then you're sitting there, yes, you're collecting money from these 10 programs that left you behind, but you're not getting anything on top of that. And you're not really expanding your brand, expanding who you are, and really setting yourself up for success in the future. So the way I look at it, I've heard this news yesterday, and obviously Clemson and Florida State will play a huge role in this, although it sounds like that one is cooling down just a little bit because it sounds like the ACC is heading for disaster kind of regardless. I think Clemson and Florida State might just wait for that to happen for them to make a move. But overall, I think you look at the Big 12 and you look at Oregon State and Washington State. The way I look at it, it's a great deal for Oregon State and Washington State. It is an okay deal for the Big 12. And for that reason, I think Oregon State and Washington State have to jump at this as soon as they possibly can. If that offer is on the table, which is very much in question right about now, we will definitely find out more as the next couple of weeks go by. But the reality is, if that is on the table, if that is an option for your future, you take it and run with it, because there's a reality where it's not there in 6 months or it's not there in a year, and then you're left out pretty much just aimlessly floating in the college football world and the college sports world. So it's a great opportunity for Oregon State and Washington State to get a little bit of a lifeline. Will they take it, or do they even have it at this moment, will be something that we'll unpack over the next couple of days. But definitely a very interesting headline, and one that could define a lot of realignment going forward. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about who needs a win the most in Week 1. We're going to talk about a number of teams, but I have one in particular that I think needs that Week 1 win more than any. So we'll talk about that right after this, so stick with us.